BSides Legacy.
Okay, cool. So the talk I'm going to be giving is it's titled Minions versus GRU, or the GRU, and I want to be discussing sort of what the role is of civilian volunteers in cyber war, and sort of probably the image they have of themselves is something like this, but the reality is it's not even this, which would be at least benign. It's a bit more complex and nuanced, and actually a bit dangerous. But of course, the problem is that the people who are suffering are actually not the opposition in this case. The role of civilians has basically been to cause problems for the people who are actually trying to do something. So why am I going to tell you this? Well, I'm the Grugq, and what I've been doing for the last decade, well, I've been doing cyber for 20 something years now, but for the last decade or so, a lot of what I focused on has been research where I do a lot of reading and mostly talking to people and listening and discussing and finding out how they work, what they do, what's useful, sort of learning and understanding from people who are engaged in operations at multiple different levels, on the defensive side, on the offensive side, in companies versus in small groups versus when they're operating individually or whatever. So I sort of I'm speaking here from a position of having discussed with a large number of people who have firsthand insight into what's going on, and I've synthesized that and sort of trying to bring that out now in a cohesive narrative, and we will see if I succeed. And the approach that we're going to go through is basically a brief introduction to not you. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but there's actually a war going on in Ukraine, and there's been a cyber component. So we're going to be talking about sort of why this war is unique, why there is cyber and war and what cyber and war does. We're going to be talking about the sort of the players, the hacks that they've done, the lessons that can be learned. Bearing in mind, of course, that in the middle of a war, it's not the ideal time to draw conclusions based on public and hearsay information. We're going to look at what we can, and then sort of close it out. And I should also point out that this overview, I think, is out of order. But anyway, we're going to be hitting these topics, if not necessarily in this order. And this image is here to let you know that there are things that seem one way, but they're not. It's about deception and stuff. Okay, so if you take nothing else away, right, this is what you should remember. Do not allow civilian volunteers to hack inside your area of operations. Right? It is not what you want. They are the opposite of what is useful if you are trying to run a war. I will get into more details on how and why, and let's go. So very quickly, we need to sort of just go over, like, there's multiple layers of war. This is not necessarily relevant, but it's important to know when we're doing analysis. So you've got the strategic layer, which is sort of the broader understanding of like what you're trying to do and where you need to be in order to do it, or sort of the objectives you need to have to achieve those ultimate goals. Then you've got sort of operational, which is the how do you take your things to the places they need to be to do the stuff that you want, or how do you achieve the objectives that you want to achieve with the resources that you have. And then we sort of have the tactical, which is the, like, what do you do once you get there? Like, what do you do to actually achieve those objectives? And As you can see, like with these three layers, basically, the higher up, the more influence the state needs to have in what's happening, and as it goes lower down, um, it sort of it becomes a smaller scale thing, and people can get involved. And so, sort of the takeaway from this is that where the civilian volunteers get involved is at the tactical layer, which is sort of not really the most useful layer to have people just show up in, particularly if they're not integrated into the previous layers. So about the war, this is a valuable cauldron of basically like an experiment to see what happens in a real peer competition with cyber, where there's a significant part of the war is actually taking place in cyber. A large part of that is actually information operations, and the Ukrainians have been absolutely smashing it on that one. The Ukrainians are just dominating, and it'll be interesting to look at why. I think there are a number of cool reasons. One of them is that the Ukrainians are led by a sort of like a young comedian who has a smartphone and is clued in. And comedians are useful because the instrument that the comedian plays is the audience. They learn to connect with people and sort of interact and get reactions out of them. That's incredibly useful if you are trying to do information operations. Anyway, I actually do not have time to go into this. So the majority of the cyber effects that we saw were actually during that initial invasion phase, particularly during the first day. This was done by Russia, where they were able to successfully isolate, and they were able to isolate the commanders, and they were able to disrupt the command and control channels. This was very effective in disrupting control and also mobilization, but the Russians were unable to exploit this for a number of reasons. But that's the important thing to remember: is that it was successful, but then that wasn't sufficient in itself. Since then, cyber has not been particularly tightly integrated into operations, and part of that is an inflexible force structure that the Russians have, where the operational control at the actual thin edge of the wedge does not have control over cyber operations. That's done from back in headquarters. So there's disconnect and stuff. But there's sort of a lot of different reasons, right? Like maybe there's nothing useful to hack. Like what exactly are you supposed to do with a DDoS that's going to fill, a tank's diesel? Like that's not going to help. There's not a lot of cyber that you can do that's going to help in artillery barrages. It could be that there's no strategic direction, or there's no resources, so no one cares. Like there's any number of reasons, and we don't know. And the reason this is important is it's important not to draw lessons. Just because something hasn't happened doesn't mean it's it shouldn't happen during this phase. It's not an indictment of cyber that it hasn't been used. It simply says in these contexts with these circumstances, it hasn't been used. So it's important to sort of not try and draw too many lessons. What we've seen in terms of actual use has been very tactical, right? It was the use of, deny, degrade, disrupt, targeting of government systems. Critical national infrastructure was targeted once and it failed. But generally speaking, it was this initial short, sharp strike and then pretty much nothing. There's been a lot of espionage. There's been some other attacks that have happened. The major cyber attacks that have happened have been outside of Ukraine as more of a signaling effort, which we will get to in many minutes. But with that sort of said, that's the cyber that we have had in the war so far. Let's talk about cyber war. And before we go on, I just want to interject for a minute, because what you're referring to as cyber war is in fact cyber war, as I've recently taken to calling it cyber plus war. So cyber is not a war fighting domain unto itself, and blah, 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 blah. The problem with the term cyber war is it sort of creates the idea of a conflict domain that exists in isolation of everything else, right? Like if you talk about air war, you don't assume that there's like no infantry involved or that the Navy doesn't matter anymore. It's part of an integrated operation. There's an entire thing going on, including the state behind it itself being actively involved in many ways to prosecute that war. It's not done in isolation. And similarly, cyber war will not be done in isolation. It's not a thing that can just happen. It doesn't exist as a Platonic ideal. It is something that has to be part of, a complete balanced war. And what that means, of course, is that wars will now have cyber elements, and we're starting to see that. We've seen it hasn't really been talked about, but in Nagorno-Karabakh, that was quite a lot of cyber stuff that went on. It was very interesting. We're going to be seeing a lot more in the future, so it's valuable to know about that. So let's start talking about, where cyber fits in war. And that's easy. So when we think about creating a warfighting capability inside cyberspace for part of our strategic intent, and we're looking at doing a global effects integration, and what the fuck? If it's called like the art of war, why are there no drawings? Right? Like, this is rubbish. Instead, I think probably the most important thing to remember is that cyber attacks are not attacks. Right? Like, no one dies, nothing gets blown up. Like, it's not actually that big a deal in like the middle of a war. It is something that can be used to augment or supplement or assist with another attack, but in and of itself, it's not an attack. And similarly, you can't really say like, this addressed a bit of the legal thing, but if people are participating in a DDoS against Russia, does that mean that they've become combatants? On the one hand, yes, they're now participating in a war, but on the other hand, it's not really an attack. So no, they're participating in a crime. It's not part of a war. Okay, so let's talk about what actual cyber warfare is. And the big caveat up front is this is wrong. Like, the taxonomy I'm about to give you is not it's not used anywhere. I don't think it's absolutely correct, but I do think it's useful. I think it is valuable to use these stages to sort of understand how civilians can participate in what's actually happening. And these are the three things. So we have espionage, information, and effects. Espionage is basically collecting information or perhaps subtle sorts of influence that can be done sort of stealthily and whatever, but it's not visible. It's something that happens covertly and in the shadows. It's heavy on stealth. It's just not an exciting thing that's going to get reported on. Information operations, on the other hand, tend not to be treated as cyber because they're basically what PR companies do, or marketing or whatever. They do not have the sort of like offensive cyber operations bling going on. But they are very, very useful, particularly strategically in terms of making sure that your allies remain on board. So, an information operation will help you sort of shape the information environment, which will then hopefully lead to influencing the behavior of the target audience. And the big one, of course, is the effects operations, which like, even this terminology is a little bit out of favor now. But again, the idea here is just to be able to understand that you've got like stealthy stuff that no one knows about, talking about stuff which no one cares about, and then actually doing things which look cool. And those are sort of like the three groups. And the effects are the stuff that like looks really cool, and the idea is that somehow it will help you in some way. That's the overall goal. But espionage is actually useful. Like, out of all of this stuff, it's the most boring, but it's also the most valuable. Like, you can actually do things with it. It actually directly helps you prosecute a war. Information operations, again, really, really important. Being able to shape the behavior of your opposition and your allies, absolutely vital to being able to win a war. Like, you want it so that your allies stay on your side and that your enemies sort of lose heart and don't want to keep fighting anymore. Like, that's what you're going for. And then you've got effects, which I mean, they're a lot more exciting than just grepping through someone's emails to see like if there's anything interesting. Uh, these sort of things, like, they seem really cool. You've got your DDoS, you've got your defacements, you've got like putting stuff on someone else's TV or playing things from hacked radios or whatever. Like, all of this stuff is just, it's flashy and it's cool. And you know it's not that useful unless it's part of an actual operation. So where does that leave us? Well, we've got cyber, we've got war, and who do we have playing in the cyber war that's actually going on right now? So if we look at the players, they sort of fall into two groups. You've got your state actors on the one hand, and you also have non-state actors. So the state actors are, by and large, not that interesting sort of to look at. Like, they do good stuff, but most of the time what they're doing is espionage. There's very few who are involved in actual effects operations. And of course, the reason for that is, as we've talked about, like, it's because espionage is actually very useful. So when we're talking about state actors, we're talking typically about state security forces. And I'm going to hit next and hope that I have a slide. Fuck yeah, look at that. Okay, so basically on the Ukrainian side, we've got the SBU, which is sort of like the KGB, but not. The GUR, which is like the GRU, but not, basically. So you've got your state intelligence service, you've got your military intelligence service. There's also the police, who have some degree of cyber capability, particularly because a not insignificant number of them used to be cyber criminals who have been sort of coerced into working. So they do have some capability, and they have, historically at least, they've wanted to participate. As far as I know, they are not doing that. They are not conducting their own cyber operations. But don't quote me on that one. As far as I know, the cyber operations are being done only by SBU, GUR, and any contractors or whatever that they might have working for them, just like NSA has got Raytheon and so on. On the other hand, in the red corner, we have Russia, who has the primary sort of operator in this war so far has been the GRU. They've done all the effects. They do a lot of the espionage. I guess as FSB is trying to wash their hands of it because they don't want to be tainted with the catastrophe. But yeah, FSB sort of has control of espionage over the near abroad. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the way that Russia considers its former satellite states. This might be a bit foreign to you. I know that the Baltics is very far away from Ukraine and stuff. So anyway, I'll skip over that. But yeah, like, basically you don't get SVR operating in Ukraine very much because it's not part of their remit. The one interesting thing is that Russia also has cyber criminals, in particular Conti, who have begun working for the state. And what's become, I think, quite interesting is that the way that their operations have evolved show increased integration with state operations, particularly the state command structure. And I really hope I've got slides on that. Okay. Non-state actors, on the other hand, is where we've got this huge mess. So we've got like the Ukrainian aligned non-state actors, starting with the IT cyber army. And sort of briefly about the IT cyber army. When Ukraine was initially invaded, they panicked, as one does being invaded. And everyone who had a half reasonably sounding idea and pitched it to the government basically got green-lighted. So this guy came up with the idea of starting a sort of like volunteer force of cyber hacker operator types who would come and help Ukraine cyber hacker operate. and like that was okay. So they basically put out this call and said, hey, everyone, please come and help us. And that attracted quite a lot of people. They did show up to help, and there was a lot of DDoS, there were a lot of defacement, there were a bunch of cyber criminals who got involved. And sort of what this reflected was, there's this dichotomy between, so you basically have two types of followers that you get on these things. There's the sympathizers and supporters. So sympathizers show up and they're like, I feel strongly about this. This is really important to me, but it's getting on past 8 o'clock and I've got a thing. So, I'm here to show my support, but I won't be here. And then, like not showing up the next week and so on, where supporters are sort of more consistent. And we saw that with basically the sort of level of activity and the number of people involved. The early phases of the war, particularly the first 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, saw a lot of activity. And then it sort of died off fairly rapidly. Basically, the criminals got bored and stopped doing defacements. All the people doing DDoS sort of had other better things to do with their time. There's still a lot of people involved, but it is a lot smaller than it was before. They are not necessarily more skilled now than they used to be, but I'm not going to go deeply into the organization of the IT Army, because one of the most important things about the IT Army is the media coverage that they've gotten, because the media coverage does not accurately reflect the reality of what they're doing. It has had the effect of attracting more volunteers. And since the IT Army has been causing problems, like their operations and the coverage that they've received has caused issues for actual legitimate real operations that are being done by Ukraine and their allies. So more volunteers has actually just made things worse. So the coverage, it misrepresented what was happening. It made more people show up, brought in more sympathizers, and it ended up alerting the Russians, and it caused a huge shift in the security posture of Russian systems. So for the first month or so, while all of this coverage was going on, Russians started getting a lot more secure. Like they worked hard. They, like we can go into basically like when there was a DDoS going on, it meant that there was no traffic that could be sent from legitimate cyber operators who are trying to hack something. If there was low-hanging fruit and it got grabbed by some random person in the US who then did a defacement, it meant that that access was not available to legitimate operators who might have been able to do something much more useful with it. It meant that people who had low-hanging fruit were motivated to go and secure things because they saw all the media coverage of what was going on and they didn't want to get hacked. So certain things that could have been hit, they were shut off. Again, things like there's a friend of mine and we were in a discussion and someone said basically like, but all of those attacks is useful, like it's noise, you can hide in the noise, they won't be able to see you. And my friend was like, yeah, it's noise for me too. Like I can't see anyway. Like it covers everyone. Like noise is noise. It's not useful. It's just a problem. And that's sort of the thing that I think has not been understood, particularly outside of the media and also in don't leave. I can see you on the camera. Okay. So it hasn't been understood by analysts, and I'm not going to name where this is from, but this is a very, very relevant quote because it cracked me up when I read it. Basically, he says, like, the IT Army, it makes no sense that the defense and intelligence services basically just did nothing and allowed the IT Army to conduct operations freely and independently because that would highly likely also lead to strategic confusion and tactical interference with the defense and intelligence services' own operations in cyberspace. You think? Like, what did you think happened? So, like the obvious problems are obvious, but people have assumed that basically, given how like important it is to not have these problems, obviously no one would actually do something this dumb. Like that makes no sense. It's got to be a lot smarter than that, and it's not. Like it's really not any smarter than it seems. It is actually that dumb, and that's sort of one of the problems here, and why it's sort of unfortunate is that you've got these guys trying to do a job, and you've got people trying to play a game, and the game players really shouldn't be fucking around here. One of the things that gets said a lot, if you see interviews with people who have volunteered to go and fight, they always say like it's not Call of Duty. If you don't have military experience, if you don't have the background, you shouldn't be here. And I think that sentiment needs to be understood for cyber as well. Like it's not a game. When someone does something in Russia that causes that asset to no longer be available to a legitimate operator, it's not a cool thing. It wasn't like clever. It's a problem. Outside of the strategic control and the strategic hierarchy, without being integrated into how the whole war is being fought, anything that is done by these independent groups is wasted. At like the best case scenario is it's completely wasted, but realistically it is negative in some aspect. Like it's either raising the security awareness of the other side, it's cutting off access, it's obscuring something, it's interrupting and interfering with like ongoing operations. Like stop it, don't do it. All right, so that's the IT cyber army. There's also been Anonymous, who sort of like they rocked up early on. They did some DDoS, some defacements, and then they got bored. The major use of Anonymous, as far as I'm aware now, is it's just used as an umbrella organization for much more interesting groups, which I'm calling tiger teams. Basically, these are groups of experienced cybersecurity professionals who have strong motivations and are turning their skills towards acting to assist in a way that they can. And these people have been doing a lot of stuff. And I think the thing to understand is the difference between them and the IT cyber army is the operations that these guys are doing are much more focused. They're still not integrated in the same way that they should be in order to be truly useful, but they are not as problematic. They don't cause the same level of issues. And so just sort of like the connection that these guys have to Anonymous is like they're not actually part of the Anonymous group. Like they don't join the channels, they don't discuss anything, they don't do any of that stuff. But a lot of their operations get attributed to Anonymous, and that's fine by everyone. Like Anonymous is not going to say we didn't do that, and these guys are not going to come out and be like, no, that was me. They want it this way. So basically, if you see a really impressive, cool hack, almost every time it's going to be the work of a tiger team or similar. Like the state does not have capacity to just fuck around. They don't run non-essential operations. They don't have the time to put into putting something on TV just for the hell of it, when they could use that to try and gain access to like the logistics backend and learn what the like the depth of the reinforcement situation is. Like they have important things to do, and it does not include playing around. So almost any time you see like a clever, fun hack, it was done by someone who's not the state, and it was not directed by the state. Okay, so that's kind of like the Ukrainian aligned side. On the Russian side, things are a bit different. We have mostly sort of Russian state linked and controlled groups. So we've sort of got like the Killnet, Hacknet stuff going on. These guys, they are very, very closely coordinated with the military. They have done a lot of high visibility effects operations. They clearly take direction on what they're supposed to do, and that direction makes sure that their operations are strategically aligned with the interests of the Russian state. So they play this big game about how, like they're independent and patriotic and whatever, and they're clearly not. I don't think anyone buys that. Then we have Conti, and Conti has done an interesting thing. Like clearly they've got some connection with FSB, as we saw from the leaks, and it seems that some portion of Conti has gone on to doing exclusively Ukraine targeted hacks to assist the Russian state in some way. And what we've seen over time is that those hacks have gone from being sort of a little bit more obvious, easy to catch, and less focused to being more stealthy and more clearly focused, which I think shows tighter operational control in targeting and in being able to sort of realize the value from this group. Like there's more interest from the command structure. This is ironically from Emotet, who was in Ukraine, but basically like this is a realistic state of the professional cyber criminal. Okay, so that was abrupt. Let's look at some of the things that have happened in the cybers, stuff that Anonymous has been associated with. So there's been a lot of data leaks via DDoS secrets. Why this is good is that it's provided a lot of data leaks. The downside, of course, is that there is so much that has been leaked that it is not possible to analyze it. There's just too much information. It's not accessible in a way that can be looked at. So who really knows what's in there? It's interesting, and maybe someone will find something valuable, but it's just been a flood of data that no one can do anything with, really. They've done a bunch of like amusing things of little to no consequence, more towards no consequence. So like, the TV stations have been hacked. They play like Ukrainian patriotic music. On Independence Day, a bunch of IP cameras were hacked and they played the Ukrainian national anthem all across Russia. There's a video put out. It's kind of amusing, but it didn't exactly stop the war. It didn't cause protests. It's just it's amusing. The one exception to an effects operation that was visible that I believe was not done by independent civilian operators, that was actually done by a state-controlled security force, is when the Crimean TV was hacked and it played an address from Zelensky. And I believe that this was coordinated with the state because it happened during an offensive. I believe it was the start of the Kherson offensive. So this was, due to the timing, this was, I believe, obviously linked to state security services. And the difference is sort of fairly clear. On the one hand, you've got, something being hacked randomly and like playing music whenever. And then you've got something that is playing an address to the people of an occupied region, which is being assaulted by the Ukrainian military. It's very clearly linked to actual military operations. On the Russian side, we've got like the various Russian nets, and they've done things which are very clearly signaling for the state. So there was a DDoS against Lithuania for reasons. Then there was this very interesting attack which didn't get a lot of press. It was in June, I believe, or perhaps very early July, and about an hour before a missile attack on Odessa, there was a call for basically DDoS and other attacks against the Odessa air raid systems. And that is very interesting because it demonstrates an operational link between the military and this group, but it also suggests that part of what they are looking at is ways to make attacks against civilians have higher casualty rates, right? Like, I think that that's very interesting. This sort of thing of going against air raid systems, the Palestinians have done in Israel as well. So, like, this is a tried and true known way of going against a state. So it's interesting to see it showing up here as well. So having looked at like some of the players and some of the hacks, I want to talk about like the reason that you have cyber. Like if you're fighting a war, the reason you have cyber is you want to be able to exploit it. Right? It's got to do something for you. Like the entire value, like the entire point of having the cyber is that it gains you some advantage and then you can exploit that advantage. So it has to do something that helps you and you can then take advantage of that help. You can, exploit it. And that's sort of like, that's a way to think about the value that the IT army brings. Like, what's the point? If it's not helping you, what's the point? Like, what's the value? So some of the things that have been amusing have been sort of like rationales for why the cyber army does what they do. I haven't seen one from them, but commentators have said things like, these guys talk about how they want to make sure that the Russian hackers are too busy defending that they don't have time to attack. And I would like to believe that that was invented by the reporters and not actually said by the army, because if they said that, then they do not understand that there are two completely different resource groups available. Like the GRU is not securing the fucking servers for the TV station. Like that's not a thing that they do. You can hack the TV station all you want, and it will not interfere with a single minute's worth of work from the GRU. Like that's not how it works. Anyway, so what's actually useful? Espionage. Espionage is really good, right? It's massively underrated, but in the middle of a war, knowing what the adversary knows and what they're doing, that's very, very useful stuff. Like you can actually do something with that. If you know about your enemy, you can start to influence their thinking. You can start to, prepare things, surprises for them. You can start targeting their command centers. You can do a lot of stuff that is actually useful in prosecuting the war. But playing pranks, like that's not mission critical. That's not very helpful. So sort of collection is better than information, is better than effects, which, as I said before, like this is a lie. That's not really how it works, but it's a useful way of thinking about it sort of generally and at a broad level to understand one aspect. Information operations, again, they're useful, right? Shaping the information environment changes how people behave because you impact their sense making. Like that's really important. It's especially important when you're talking about your allies because you want them to continue to support your efforts. It's useful, though not necessary, against the enemy because you want to confuse them or deceive them, make them depressed, make them lose morale, distress them. You want to do it to your own people to make sure that they maintain the will to fight because, war is a contest of wills. And so you want to keep that up. And in a way, you could sort of say like everything is an information operation. You could go that far. But anyway, like they're useful. But, they don't really get the attention that effects operations do because effects operations look really cool and they're flashy. And so you sort of, like when we think about effects operations, it's worthwhile to sort of break them down into sort of elements that they consist of. So there's the thing itself, like the effect itself. Like if you deface a website, like the website is itself defaced. That's a thing. That's the effect. But then there's also the perception of the effect. Like, does this mean that the company running that website is no longer secure? Has other data been compromised? Does this mean that they don't care about their users and they haven't spent enough money on protection? Like there's the perception, and then there's sort of like the psychological impact as well, which is the like, oh my God, they're dominating us in cyber. We're being hacked. This is terrifying. They could be anywhere. Like, what if they do the banks next? These other aspects, like the perception and the psychological impact, they like you acclimate to them. Like the more it happens, the less impressive it is. So, for example, now the Ukrainians have had 8 years of Russian cyber, and there's very little psychological impact from being hacked. Like it doesn't really faze them that much because it's a thing that happens all the time. And it's worth keeping this in mind because the stuff that the civilians are doing as volunteers are effects operations, which means that they are making these effects less impactful in future. Not necessarily critical, but something to keep in mind. Similarly, the quote from Bonaparte of the "You must not fight with one enemy for too long, or else you will teach him all your art of war." And that's a mistake that the Russians made with cyber in Ukraine. So, takeaways here: espionage is valuable, info is critical, effects, like contextually, they can be useful. They can work as supplements, they can be enablers. There's a lot of ways that effects can be useful, but in and of themselves, they're not really, as we said earlier, cyber attacks are not attacks. Like, they're not that important. They seem like the sort of thing that you'd want to do, right? Like they get all of the excitement, but the reality is, like, you just need oil changes. Like you need espionage. That's how you win. It's not through having something that seems cool. And this sort of brings us into, like, where do these civilian volunteers fit into cyber operations? And well, they're not very good for espionage, right? Like, you've got people who are not integrated into the command hierarchy, who have made up completely of volunteers, which means that they're going to include members of the opposition, the enemy. You cannot tell them, like, what to get, and you can't make it so that they collect on things that you actually need to know about, because that's a security risk. You cannot control where they go, where they don't go, because all of this stuff reveals sensitive information about your own actual operations that they have no business knowing and that you do not want to broadcast to the opposition. So you can't control them. You can't trust any of the data that they get. You can't tell them what to do, because like, they're civilians that, not only do they not necessarily take direction, but any direction you give them is basically public. So you may as well just print out publicly what you want to know and see if they do it from there. And that's also not great. And you cannot trust anything that comes from them. Like, they are as likely to be the enemy as to be trying to help you. So anything that you do collect is potentially tainted, messed with, contaminated, maybe even infected with malware. It is not really a useful espionage capability, having just random civilians going out and operating in cyber. It's not to say that there aren't ways that they can help. There are certainly channels that this can be useful, but it's more tactical than strategic. It's sort of very much the, where are the tanks now? Like, that's useful. What is the location of a bunker or a barracks or something like that? These specific sorts of information are useful, and they can be used and verified. And then, if they're false, it's not a big deal. But for example, if you were to steal, like, a mail spool, that's different. Okay. Why does this matter? Well, because it means that effects operations are basically the only thing that civilians can do. Like the only offensive cyber that's left them is effects operations, because they cannot do espionage at a level that's actually useful. And unless they're on the ground, they can't do the tactical espionage. So the only thing that's sort of really left is fucking around with stuff in a way that's going to cause problems. Is there a solution? Yes, there is. So the solution I propose is information sharing and public-private partnerships. Essentially, like, these are jokes, but the way that I think it could possibly work is if the civilian groups make the information that they have, including their targeting and their planning and sort of their collection, their take, if they make that information available in a channel that can be collected and analyzed by state authorities, then there might be some gold that shows up in that stream. Like, that could be useful. Similarly, that information could be useful in informing sort of where not to go, because it's going to be DDoSed for a while. That's basically the partnership as well that I'm thinking about. So we're coming to the end, and I'm only a little bit over, so this is great news. Final thoughts. So very, very rapid. This is one of those, I was told that you have to like tell people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So this is what I told you: strategic, operational, tactical, espionage, info, and effects. And also, basically, having a capability that exists in isolation is useless. If you have the ability to cause effects, but it's not under your control, and it happens independently of what you are trying to actually do strategically, it's worse than useless. So, you don't want civilians fucking around in your war. Like, civilian volunteers, like, this is something for the guys doing the Tallinn manual. I'm sure they're going to be very excited to write about it. It's a legal problem for someone else to deal with. Practically, a way to organize these sympathizers in a way that's actually productive, that's a challenge. I don't have an answer. I don't know how you do it. I do know that having them do defacements and DDoS and other random hacks, that is not what you want. That is not helpful. So those are the lessons we've learned. Civilians must not conduct cyber operations without integration into the strategic command hierarchy. Basically, cyber should be left to state or state-affiliated actors, because the stuff that's being done, like, it's not a game. It needs to be integrated, and in order to be exploited, it has to be controlled and understood and integrated into the entire system that's fighting the war. Like, just showing up and doing stuff on your own is not really helping. Like, these uncoordinated, independent, out of nowhere operations, they don't really help, and they cause more problems than not. So if you want to donate to, like, the war, donate to charity. Don't donate bandwidth to DDoS. So, like, where do the civilians go? Fucking somewhere else. Like, I don't care. Like, don't come here. It's a war. Go away. All right. That's it. Thank you. We now have -5 minutes for questions.
Thank you. And we have now time for questions. And as we earlier, there is already one hand is up there. Can the microphone run to the second, third row? Yeah, there is a bit of a struggle to get the microphone to the Oscar.
Thank you very much for the talk. My question is, how much did you mitigate information operations when preparing for this talk? So how do you research something where all parties have incentive to muddle the truth, shall we say?
Yeah, like, well, there's a lot of echo. Okay, so the information operations stuff is very, very public, typically. In terms of the uh, actual stuff going on, like I clearly, like obviously I don't have any privileged information about espionage operations or whatever. What I do have is access to people who like either work in assistant organizations or people who are familiar with what's going on, and like they've passed to me things about like what is the difficulty that they faced because of like the IT cyber army. In terms of like how things are done during war, like it's a thing I've been researching, so I can generically state that like espionage is a good thing that you want to do. In terms of like the information operations that happen, like we can see, like again, like that's a thing that I've been involved with is looking at Russian information operations starting a little bit before 2016. And again, like it's a thing that we have visibility on, like we can see what's going on. So it's like it's not as difficult. Like it depends on what you're trying to do, but like for the purposes I have, it's not that difficult. I just need to know, generally speaking, what are the things they do, why are they doing it, and sort of what is the result like, and that's fairly easy to get.
Okay, we have next question, I think. Thank you.
Hello. Firstly, I want to thank you about your presentation and your talk. I would like to come back on your the thing you said about cyber attack are not attack because nobody dies. What do you think about people dying about cyber attack in hospital, like in Germany, if I remember well?
Yeah. So it's a like it's a generalization that is useful to think about. Not that there are not exceptions, but typically things to understand about attacks are sort of like the psychological impact that they have. So ways of thinking about this, for example, are like carpet bombing. The idea with doing strategic carpet bombing of an enemy nation is that you are going to beat the population into submission. That dropping all these bombs will make them give up hope and lose support. And the reality is that the actual psychological impact of the attack is to make people draw tighter together and to resist harder. So that sort of intended effect of the attacks doesn't happen. It actually has the opposite effect. Cyber also has psychological effects which are counterintuitive in a way. So if you attack a nation, you are likely to make them draw closer together. Whereas if you attack an individual, you sort of get this victim blaming thing that happens. Like in the industry, we know, like we've been sort of training ourselves and we're trained not to blame the victim, but the public doesn't have that. They're not going to look at a cyber attack against something as equivalent to a kinetic attack against the same target. If you blew up a hospital and it only killed one person, that would still be a significant attack that would have a lot of psychological response that would sort of require a political response of some sort. If you do a cyber attack that kills one person, you, for example, could not use that as justification to invade a country. Like you would not have public support at the same level because people will be going like, why does like my brother have to go and die because someone couldn't install some fucking patches, right? Like I do not want my my sons being sent off to die because someone didn't have budget for a firewall. So in like in that sense, as attacks, like they're not really attacks. But similarly, like doing DDoS against Russia, like it doesn't attack Russia. It doesn't do anything that actually helps the war in any way. Like if attacking Russia in some kinetic fashion would help, like it doesn't do anything. It's inconsequential and it's meaningless in terms of the war itself, except in how it changes the environment and adjusts the security posture of people who, ideally you'd want to have a very weak security posture so that they would be easy pickings for the Ukrainian forces. So yes, like a cyber attack could kill someone, but like that's I think that's quibbling about specifics when the point is more about like they don't have the impact of an attack and they don't have the utility of an attack and they're not reproducible in the same way. They're not sort of like instant. Like there's a lot about them that are just not very useful in the same way that a bomb is useful, but they're far more useful in a lot of other ways. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but that explains a little bit more of my thinking about it, I hope.
Thank you for your answer. That's really appreciate it.
There's actually one question, I think, back there. Okay, we'll take one question, and after this question, there is a question for the Grugq. Which of the three questions is the winning question? But the question first.
The winning question is whoever offers to share.
Hi.
Whoever promises to share the prize with me, they've asked the correct question.
Hi, thank you very much appreciated the talk. The one area that I've become greatly concerned with is the BGP rerouting. And so it's been publicized in the last few months that Ukrainian operators has been forced, right, to provide their transit through Russian operators. So of course, Russia now has all the intelligence for all of the traffic that's been rerouted to them. I believe that Ukraine is starting to use more of Starlink, right? And so one of the questions that I have for you, while in the beginning, months ago, the call to arms for civilians might have seemed unstructured, right? It might be that there's actually strategic objectives both on either side, but they really need more manpower that once they then have gathered the intelligence and then maybe have targets and operational aspects, that they will then use these volunteers to carry that out. So do you see, from your experience, that there's more structure or not?
Yeah, and I can see how that's appealing, but as far as I know, that is not the case. It's important to realize how state organizations actually work. So the intelligence services are like, they're the intelligence services, they're cool, they do espionage, they do intel, they do counter-intel, like all this stuff. They're civil servants, right? Like they're a bureaucracy that collects information. They do not really integrate well with just volunteers, right? It integrates well if they recruit people, like if you become an asset for them, that's a thing they know how to do. Like that is a structure that they have and you can fit into the system that they have for managing external people. If you show up as a volunteer, they do not have a way of processing that. That's not a thing that they do. It is like, and they don't change quickly either, right? Like if you want like rapid change, doing something in 4 or 5 years is considered pretty cool. Like that's a speedy, flexible organization. So in the timeframes that we're looking at, like that's not a thing that can actually, I would be very, very surprised if the intelligence services were able to create a way for civilian volunteers to assist meaningfully in cyber operations in the last 6 months. Like that would shock me. I don't think that that's a thing they're going to do because as far as I know, they would be more interested in expanding their own capability, which another way of thinking about it is they want more budget and more headcount, right? Like they're gonna look at it and someone's gonna say, all right, we need more cyber. Now, if you are the head of the cyber department, the correct response is great. I need more money and I need to hire more people because then I can give you more cyber. The incorrect response is, awesome, let's just put something on Telegram and see who shows up, right? Like that's not how you get promotions. That's not how you advance your career. Like that's not the way that state organizations work, generally speaking. So like there was this panicked call that went out, and it went out from the developing technology guy, whatever. Like he's not part of the security services, right? Like he's the tech guy, and it's cool, and like they do good stuff, but they are not part of the intelligence services or part of the military in terms of being integrated within what's happening in cyber. So he was sort of operating on his own on that one. And if you look at the messaging that's happened sort of since, I think they got a lot of pushback internally, because you can see that the like the way that they talk about things is very guarded, and it's sort of a little bit open to interpretation. So if you're being generous, you could go, oh, okay, like these guys like the IT army. But if you know the backstory of how it's caused them problems, you can see that they're trying to not say like, these guys have fucked us over, I wish this hadn't happened, without saying that. Like, so I think one of the recent ones was there were like one of the ministers, I think that particular minister was asked about like recent like DDoS or something like that. And his response was along the lines of, we're happy with everyone that comes and assists Ukraine in our fight for freedom. And, like that's sort of how they're doing it. Like they don't really like what's happened. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Grugq. And uploads from the Tallinn side.
Thank you.
And but as we have some merch for those who are asking questions, then you had 3 questions. Which one of these would you pick? The first one about methods, the second about hospital, and
yeah, I actually like the third one because I get to talk about how civil servants do empire building, which I think is it's a good way of thinking about cyber. There's 2 sides to it.
Okay, thank you. And I think volunteers will help the winner.